Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner podcast, where I interview Treasury professionals about their Treasury careers. Each and every week, I'll talk to treasurers about how they built their careers, where they are now, where they see both themselves and the Treasury profession going to next. Let's get on with the show. In this week's show, I'm joined by Chris Blow, Senior Director of Treasury at Twilio. Twilio is a software company that strengthens businesses by unifying their data to build insightful paths to customers so they're smarter with every interaction and able to outmaneuver their competition. Across 180 countries, millions of developers and hundreds of thousands of businesses use Twilio to create magical experiences for their customers. Chris will explain who Twilio are. We're going to go right back to the beginning. Chris is a regular listener to the show when he's out walking the dog. Chris, if you would, take us back to the beginning, how you first started in finance, then Treasury. Obviously, I've known you for many years, so over to you, sir.
Hey, Mike, great to be here. Thanks for having me. And as you say, avid listener and walking the dog. It all goes back to beginning at college or university. I was studying mathematics at the time at the University of Portsmouth, and I heard on the wind that in the business school, there was this year in industry opportunity, right? So you do your first 2 years, you disappear for a year, and then you come back. But it wasn't something that was being offered in the School of Mathematics. So I started applying, ended up opportunity interview with Intel, got offered the chance to go there. The roles were unassigned at the time. It was like a blanket, hey, you're applying for an internship in finance, right? I ended up getting put in accounting, which was, it was a great experience, good kind of exposure to the real world. The company was fantastic in terms of the culture, the people, the community, like they had a number of graduates. The accounting team was also a really good team, very diverse. It was sort of a EMEA focus, but there was guys on the team from Israel, Egypt, Russia. And so it was a really interesting place to be. But I didn't like the accounting piece,
Right.
Essentially.
And
for me,
we touched on it, that you're joining Intel, who are obviously computer chips and everything else, or what was Intel at the time? This is back in 2009. So what was the company like then?
It was a market leader, right? This was just after the iPhone. So I think at the time, like Intel wasn't taking abuse for missing the smartphone. It's been a bit more of an interesting story since then. For me, I actually knew Intel very well as a kid. My dad was a physics teacher, and we used to spend a lot of time kind of playing around making our own PCs. So I was actually pretty well versed. So when I got that opportunity, I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, I actually understand this.
I know the company, yeah.
It was in Swindon, which is a bit of a move for me at the time, but actually it turns out great city for grads, nice old town, cheap cost of living. The company itself at the time was, I would say, a market leader, and not in where we are today with disruptors of things like NVIDIA and TSMC. Like, it was a very different environment at the time in kind of the late 2000s at Intel.
And that was your internship, if you like. So you were suddenly used to getting up proper time, and then you were thrown back to university.
So I've never been very academic. My general feeling is I think exams are pretty poor judgment on people's skill sets, but I was always worried about my final year. But then when I went back, frankly, it was a walk in the park. You went from doing 45-hour weeks to then being asked to do 50% of that plus a couple of pieces of coursework. And so that was actually almost like a holiday in the end. And I think when we look back and you talk to people, my final year at university that was the real year that I got work done. Whereas for me, it felt like a bit of a year off, which is nice. And it's always easy in hindsight, right? You probably see this yourself. Like, you always think you have it hard at the time, and then you get into the working world, then you go into working world with young kids, and all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, like, I had so much time in the past compared to what I have today. No, I think it was for me in my career, although early on, I think it was a good level setter, right?
So then talk about, so you rejoined Intel. How did you then get into Treasury and things?
Yeah, just pot luck. As I said, I wasn't sold in the accounting piece, but was sold on Intel. There was probably, I'm trying to think what the numbers were now. There was 100 in the kind of internship program, and maybe 10, 15% of those came back in various roles, so finance or sales or accounting, whatever it was. And so there was a number of finance roles, more on the revenue finance, channel finance, accounting, tax, and then this kind of treasury black box. And I knew a little bit because my housemate during my internship year, he did his internship in the treasury team. So I knew a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But there was this opportunity there. At the time, they'd also decided they weren't going to take on an intern the following year in Treasury. They were basically creating a graduate role in Treasury. I think just because some of the knowledge was quite niche, that kind of 12-month turnover was disruptive in a way, because it was a relatively small team in the region. So anyway, so this was this role, and I said, yeah, sure, let's give that one a try. It's still the company I loved, and I was lucky where a lot of the graduates that came back were my friends and people I spent a lot of time with. Yeah, and then it balloons from there. But I'd always been interested in markets and what's going on in the world, that side of things. So actually, the kind of numbers background combined with the more kind of focus on what's happening in the world and linking the two together in hindsight was interesting, and is where we spent the last 13, 14 kind of years of my career.
Yeah. And then talk us through what Treasury was like at that stage, how it was structured. To give everyone listening, you were then at Intel for 10 years or so from then, but you were all the way through the UK, then the Netherlands, then the US. So just walk us through those and what Treasury was and everything else for the listeners, as if you're a listener, if you like.
Sure. So I think at the time when I joined, Treasury was still very much more regional. So we had kind of US team covering Americas, a team in the UK covering EMEA, and then we had a team in Asia, primarily in what was at the time Singapore, but then became China and India, covering Asia. And what transitioned over time is, rather than having regional centers, we ended up having kind of global functions. Rather than in the region doing its cash management and investments, you'd have a global lead that would then run a matrix structure across the various regions. So I started out doing the kind of more treasury operations, cash management, I guess you call it middle office type function in the EMEA region, which eventually, as I said, we got more functional broken. So you have someone who was leading like global FX or kind of interest rate hedging, someone leading cash and investments globally. Treasury operations got centralized in centers of excellence in India and Colombia. Debt capital markets was primarily run out of the US because it was headquarters. So that's what really changed. But the scale also was, if I look at it today versus me at Twilio, the scale was just in a different world, right? We also had credit and collections fell under Treasury, as well as insurance and a few other pieces. So we were probably...
How many people were in Treasury in total? How many?
Yeah, 150, 200. I would say probably out of that 50% was credit and collection. So maybe if you carve that piece out.
And then, so you started as a Treasury analyst. What was that like for you? And you discovered Treasury. What was it like, again, for the listeners? Some learnings from that time?
I made a lot of mistakes. That's the good and bad part of Treasury, right? Is when you do something, it's visible on the good side and the bad side. I was very lucky at the time. My first boss was from the US, but was on assignment in the UK. And he was a very forgiving guy, very patient guy. And I think Intel was like a very safe space, I would say. You were given opportunities. If you made mistakes, you were allowed to learn from those mistakes. It's different between making mistakes and making the same mistake. And so at the same time, because of we were a global treasury, we've moved people around. So we'd had a guy come over from India. We'd had a couple of people come in from the US. We pulled someone in from Russia. So actually that team was almost like a hot pot of kind of global experience within Treasury. And actually, one of the things I really miss about Intel is the ability to just, the knowledge that you had around you. So for me at the time in my early 20s, you could just, there were no stupid questions. And there was always some expert that would knew it in great detail, which was fantastic at the time.
And talk through then the development. I said you were there for 10 years. So walk us through the progression and then also the international moves and stuff.
Yeah, progression, super high level, went from middle office kind of cash operations, things like working on in-house bank and kind of corporate restructurings, especially some of that was around Russia at the time with the first kind of annex of Crimea, and a lot more on the system side. So we'd had an in-house built TMS. We went to Quantum or SunGuard. So there was that piece, and then a lot of kind of connectivity around connecting up to speed with SAP and integrating with some of the legacy stuff, and then some work around compliance and use of bots. So that was the kind of middle officey piece, but it was still very operational. And then in between that and the next role, which was more in the FX kind of hedging risk management space, we'd had this initiative at Intel where we were trying to consolidate our global cash pool. At the time, there was 3 or 4 in the world, and it was also at the time when those cash pools tend to sit in regions that were becoming politically unfavorable, Cayman Islands, this kind of thing, right? And there was an initiative where we were going to consolidate our international cash into a region or into a country. And I was working on that with a colleague, and it came down to either the Netherlands or Switzerland. And I didn't know at the time I was going to end up being shifted to where we ever ended up. So if I'd known that, maybe being an avid skier, I might have said Switzerland. But yeah, and so that kind of came along. When we put the cash pool in the Netherlands, there was conversations at the time around substance. Do you have the people who are investing the cash in the country? Do you have auxiliary functions, accounting, tax, whatever there? So that's essentially what happened. We added tax and accounting people. We needed treasury people to go. Everybody else said no. And they were like, okay, we better ask Chris. Like scraping the barrel. But at the time, for me, it was easy because I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have kids. And the guys who were being asked, they did have young kids. They did have a mortgage. So there was more complexity. And frankly, it was a very short move. It was when I was trying to meet with banks and they were living kind of Swindon way, it's actually quicker for me to get from Amsterdam into Canary Wharf than it is to get from Swindon. It wasn't too big a shift. And so that was the Netherlands piece. And the other kind of nice challenge on the Netherlands piece is we were hiring people in, but we were hiring people in from within the business, but from other parts of the business, from the credit team, from broader finance roles. So they knew Intel, but they didn't necessarily know Treasury.
Yeah.
So it's like a great opportunity for me to help guide those guys and integrate those guys into Treasury and understand a little bit more. What does it mean to form a team and that dynamic? At the time, my boss is actually based in Israel. So we had some legacy UK people who hadn't shifted to the Netherlands. We had a group in the Netherlands and we had a group in Israel. And so it was an interesting dynamic and it came with its own set of challenges. And at the same time, I was then transitioning away from the kind of middle office to more front office role on the FX side, which again was a relatively easy transition. Like on the kind of cash management side, I did a lot in the spot FX space. I understood a lot of the kind of entity structures and the flows. And it was a similar story on FX as it was on the broader business about consolidating, bringing into a centralized program, not having differences in the region, doing kind of less, but doing it better. Yeah. So rather than hedging, I think at one point we were at 15 currencies. I think we end up close to 5 or 6. And really looking at that and saying, okay, what's driving the risk? And how do we shrink that program down and make it more efficient without putting more risk for the business? Which was a big chunk of kind of what we did in the Netherlands, plus some compliance stuff like at the time.
And you mentioned they're sort of making moves. I know that when I had Chan from PayPal on the show earlier this year, and we talked about him moving from the West Coast of the US to Singapore, and then he came back again, and I'd asked him making international moves because you followed it from Swindon to the Netherlands and then to the US. So how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think the Netherlands was always going to be somewhat of a dead end. And I knew that going in the sense that if you could have stayed there forever, although now with what's happening in terms of restructuring, it would have been challenging. But it was certainly like it was creating a ceiling. And my ambition had always been to get to the US because I wanted to be at the headquarters. Because as much as we say people in the regions do drive strategic change and influence what's happening, it's a lot easier to do that at the headquarters, right? Whether that's US headquarters or otherwise. It was always the plan going in. The challenge was like, could I leverage the Netherlands to get enough advocates? And we talk about a lot of this with kind of people coming up through Twilio and saying how important it is to have advocates, right? There's going to be situations when people go into the room and talk about you, and it can't just be your boss, right? It needs to be their peers. It needs to be their managers that kind of understand and have a relationship with you. And I was very lucky at Intel because through kind of projects and through kind of the consolidation or the globalization of the functions, I spent a lot of time with those people. And also I had bosses that were very good at giving me recognition and giving me visibility and giving me opportunity. And that luck / intention is somewhat carried through in the Twilio sense, because if I look at today, I happened to work for the now CFO for 12, 18 months before she became CFO, right? So sometimes you get lucky. I also, at Intel, a couple of the bosses I had also transverse levels relatively quickly. Yeah, that's helpful.
You make that luck in some ways as well. So you then became senior treasury manager out in California and then headed back, or what happened after that period of time?
So California was fantastic at Intel just because I was still doing, when I first transitioned across, the hedging role, essentially the same role I was doing in the Netherlands, but now just from the US, right? And so we had a kind of a matrix structure. So the team had India, China, Europe, and then in the US. But it was became very much more a job about educating the business unit CFOs, why we were hedging, what we were trying to do, why it mattered, what it meant for their part of the business. And originally I thought, yeah, that's a one-time exercise. But the thing is, we had 5 or 6 business units, CFO heads would roll over every 18 months to 24 months. So basically every quarter you were re-educating somebody, right? And at the same time, we were spending a little bit more time. We had a hedge committee that we presented to CFO, and I'd done that in the past as coverage, like over the phone, but now you're doing it in person. So I think it was great in terms of getting exposure and learning how to talk to senior folks, right? And what you should say, what you shouldn't say. But I think that kind of comes back to what I said, like Intel being a very safe space, like you're allowed to make mistakes. The feedback was very constructive and very timely. So that was the biggest part of being with Intel in California was frankly was the exposure and the kind of one-off projects, because if we were doing some kind of M&A deal or some kind of strategic investment, like that information wouldn't typically flow out to the regions. So there was a lot more kind of project type stuff going on. And just the ability to essentially we had most of the kind of functional leads there, as well as credit collections, retirement investments, insurance. So there was opportunity to talk to these guys, get involved in projects, like leverage the kind of knowledge you had on the more core treasury function, and then work with those guys on other initiatives, which was super interesting. And then in terms of what happened there, it's more of a personal dynamic. As I said, yeah, my wife had been great the whole way through this. Like when we moved to the Netherlands and when we moved to the US, like when we were first talking about going to the Netherlands, she joked, not even a joke, I guess she was deadly serious, that we weren't going abroad. And there was this classic inflection point where one of her friends said, "You'd never do it." And that was the end of it. Like it was done deal as far as I was concerned. But once we got that move to the Netherlands, the first thing that she said when we landed was, "Hey, we're not going to the US," which is how things ended up.
Yeah.
But a lot more difficult to integrate in the US than in the Netherlands. It sounds weird. Like we always think of like the UK maybe as a special relationship with the US or like a 51st state or whatever you want to call it. The culture is very different. Like even California, just in terms of the ease of getting around, the general environment, like it's actually it feels a lot more homely or familiar in the Netherlands than it does in the United States. I think we just had harder, more challenge integrating in the United States. And then my eldest son, who's 4 now, when he was born, so there was a bunch of surgeries and he's doing great now, but there was a lot of stress at the time. And part of that dynamic was, I think we need more help. And that's very hard. Like at the time it was COVID as well. So yeah, we got to this point where it was not an ultimatum, but okay, I'd like to go home. And then for me, selfishly, I was trying to figure out, can I get the best of both worlds, right? Can I stay in the kind of West Coast tech bubble, so to speak, but can I get my family where they want to be in the UK? And I was lucky in the sense that the guy who was running Treasury, or he was actually running investor relations and Treasury, was a one-man band at the time. I knew him. He was a guy ex-Intel. I worked for a number of years, and he actually lived close by. He ended up being always a close friend. And so we would joke about it, right? Oh, wouldn't it be funny if this kind of worked out? And then it did. And what was interesting in that dynamic for me is when I joined Twilio, it felt very familiar because a lot of the process, or at least initial processes, were based on my previous colleagues' experiences at Intel. Also, when he was talking about putting new policies in place at Twilio, like we would chat about it
Explain
on a Friday.
Explain for the audience, if you would. So you made the move to join Twilio. Who are they? I gave a little bit of the header of the shirt.
Yeah. So as you say, there's a lot of spiel here, but we're a customer engagement platform. And the way to think about that really is we're trying to help business bring together data, communications, and with some kind of layer of intelligence to help them interact and understand their customers. And so what does that mean? What's an example of that? If you think of, say, Uber, for example, where like you may interact with Uber like for an app, but there's some facilitation that happens in the background in terms if you try to call the driver through the app, it then connects to their cell phone, right? So some of the plumbing. There's examples in terms of how we might manage with Domino's in terms of how you interact with them through the app, how you might interact with them through the kind of help center, how you might also get coupons or kind of customer feedback from them. So it's very much every aspect of communications, and then now trying to add the data layer and then AI. And I think where Twilio is really well positioned is the misconception on AI is the bit that matters is the models.
Yeah.
And although they're very important,
the bit that matters is the data. And frankly, like who owns the data or who has access to the data. And so if you look at companies like Google, Amazon are doing a great job of basically taking your data and then using that data to provide you personalized experience. Twilio essentially wants to do that for everybody. And I think this kind of AI wave is just the kind of catalyst that Twilio needs to bring that to market at scale. And I think we've been making some good progress there. Tough couple of years in the tech industry, lots of restructuring, people getting a little bit ahead of their skis in the kind of COVID boom. But I think right sized and more focused on the kind of near-term future now.
Tell us about Treasury there, sort of thing. So how is Treasury structured? Again, obviously, it's to try and give some value for the audience about the do's and don'ts of Treasury, if you like.
Yeah, much more simple in terms of structure. As I said, it used to be, so Twilio IPO'd in 16, basically from 16 through to beginning when Treasury was like 50% of one person.
Yeah.
And the other 50% was IR. And there was a lot going on. It was much more a case of let's keep the business running. Yeah, we'd had various equity offerings, we'd had a debt offering, we had a convert. And so when I joined, they had just hired a manager. And so there was two of us. And then at the beginning of 22, we added a third person. And then at the beginning of 24, we added a fourth person. But we've been very intentional, right? I think when we hired in 20, it was an internal hire. I was like the classic worst case scenario, right? You walk into a new organization, you're like, okay, let's get a lay of the land. And then within a week, I was like, I'd like some more headcount, please. To which the answer was no, but if you can find somebody internally that's interested in the role, then go ahead. So I just thought this great girl, her name's Margaret or Mag, she sits in Ireland, background in accounting, accounts payable, just really process driven, really hardworking, but also knew everybody. She's been at the company now for 6-7 years. She's worked with all the people internationally, so she instantly gave us that connection to those stakeholders that we didn't have in the past. And she's been great ever since. She continues to drive basic treasury operations for the company. She's working on things like dashboarding, reporting, some really cool stuff. And then Jen, who had been hired just before I joined, who's based out on the East Coast, she has been the one-man band treasury shop in her previous role. She was accounting and identified that basically there was this whole treasury function they should care about. And so she was super in depth on payments. She'd also worked with a lot of currencies on the FX risk management side, and generally really great in a crisis, right? And so they're actually not even great in a crisis. She's the kind of person that sees it coming a couple of months before anybody else.
Hello, it's Mike here from the Treasury Recruitment Company. You've just been hearing my voice here talking to another amazing guest, but I just thought I'd jump in. I hope we're linked on LinkedIn. At linkedin.com/MR Treasury, Mr. Treasury, to you and I. That means that then I can share our latest video blogs. I do them each and every week where I talk about how to get your next pay rise, how to improve your career, how to find your next role. If you're looking to recruit, I'm here to help. Connect to me on LinkedIn. I'll be looking forward to it. Just say, Mike, heard your message on the podcast. Thought we'd connect. Let's get on with the show. You've heard the podcast that I asked people about where they see the challenges for Treasury and things like that. You're the Treasury Director there. What are you seeing as the key challenges for Treasury at the moment?
I think the broader challenge is resource, right? I think it's the same for all functions, right? It's not just a Treasury problem. It's a general kind of G&A, right? Do more with less. And so it's really, I think, a technology play, right? And also, where do you want your expertise to be? So a classic example would say like at Intel, we invested all our own cash, right? We had a team of 5 or 6 globally doing that. Whereas at Twilio, we use separately managed accounts or asset managers. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's definitely different in terms of resourcing, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, like leveraging tools on the FX side, like leveraging certain TMS partners, like when I go and talk to peers, and especially when I through kind of various benchmarking groups and things, there's a stark difference, I think, between especially maybe like the tech space or the newer tech space versus some of the more legacy tech. So let's say yes, just Siemens, IBM, Intel, HP, Dell, whatever you want to call them, in the use of technology and resourcing. So that was an eye-opener for me because we essentially do almost everything we were doing at Intel, we do at Twilio, but the scale slightly different. But it's still a relatively heavy lift. But again, it's pros and cons, right? Because you also got a lot more visibility now, right? In the previous role at Intel, maybe once a quarter I'd be presenting to the CFO. In the role at Twilio, presenting regularly to the CFO, talking to the board relatively regularly.
The C-suite know who you are. So your ability to drive change is just amplified because of your access, essentially.
Yeah. And where do you see Treasury going next? What are the new things? You've heard this. What other areas do you think that Treasury needs to deal with?
Yeah, the phrase that gets thrown around a lot is this strategic treasurer, right? Which I agree, but I do think there's almost like a fundamental right to be earned. And I was talking about this just yesterday, actually, at Twilio. I think you obviously got to have your house in order and you've got to have job one, like just down, right? It's nobody comes to Treasury and knows this unless that goes wrong. I think we talked about this in the past, like the challenge in Treasury is that you typically get a lot more visibility when things are going wrong, and there's a lot more pressure on you to perform. And if you don't perform, like there are repercussions, not only to the business, but also to you as a function. So I think you've got to have that. You've just got to have that down. It's always got to be forefront in your mind. But being this kind of catalyst across the business, right? So Treasury has the benefit of working with all kinds of stakeholders, whether that be corporate FP&A or finance side. Maybe it's more accounting, tax, whatever it might be. Like we can connect the dots essentially. And we also have access to data that people don't think about in terms of there's an accounting way of looking at things. There's also a cash way of looking at things, right? What's really happening in my business? We're even looking at initiatives now in Treasury at Twilio. Like how can we be a strategic partner or a pipeline driver for sales and product? Like we have all these products that are utilized by financial services industry. Like Treasury, we have all the contacts in financial services, like we talk to these guys all the time. How do we then leverage those relationships to drive ARR or revenues for a business? So I think that's the change rather than Treasury being an operational function. I've heard some people describe it as shifting from a cost center to a profit center. I don't think that's quite the right way of saying it, but along those lines, essentially.
Cool. And just we wrap up each show each week, sort of thing, takeaways. If you look back over your career, or again, it's great, you've heard the show before, you know how we finish it. We'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes, but what are the takeaways you would say for?
I always, I think, live my career by if you don't ask, you don't get,
Okay.
right? And the worst case someone can say is no. And that's worked out very well for me. I also think if you're going to do that, you have to have a mindset that you're going to say yes. If people aren't going to bring problems to you, if you're going to help them. So I think that general mindset is helpful. I think for me, looking back on kind of career so far, I wish I could have learned a bit earlier. And obviously we learn through our careers, but I think I had this wealth of kind of knowledge and through peers and things at Intel that often gave me really great advice. But sometimes it took me a couple of years to really digest that and to implement it. And so when I look back now in certain situations, you made life hard for yourself there, Chris. If you just done what X has said, rather than saying, I know what I'm doing, I think it could have made life a little bit easier. The other one that I haven't done, which obviously people talk about, and I think you get it on the podcast as well, is like breadth, right? In terms of finance breadth or business breadth. That's one thing I haven't really done. Like I've had the opportunity where I'm changing countries and I spent a lot of time working with different cultures and different parts of the business. I haven't gone and done an FP&A role. I haven't gone and done an ops role. And I think if I look where I am in my career now, 15 years in, if I was to change something like somewhere in the middle there, should I have done that or could I have done that? And would that be easy to get or do 5, 10 years into your career versus 15, 20 years into your career? I think undoubtedly it is. And so you don't realize early on in the career, like the decisions you make, a bit like when you're at school, right?
Yeah.
Like you start to narrow your funnel, which is fine. If you like your funnel, that's fine. And I do like my funnel. But at the same time, like the world is an ever-changing place. And so keeping your skill sets broad enough, you insulate yourself as you go forward. I think that's something that I think we underappreciate, and I certainly underappreciate it going up. Not to say again that people didn't tell me that. I think people say it a lot. The challenge I had for me going through the career is typically the people who were telling me that had never lived it themselves, which I always find hard. Yeah. When I was talking about moving countries, like the guys who'd be telling me about it, saying, "Oh yeah, 100%, like you should definitely do that." Like these guys have worked for Intel for 25 years in Swindon. And I think at the time I was saying, that's hard, it's easy for you to say because you never did it. But then when I look at it now, I think these guys were probably saying it because similar to me, they're like looking back saying, I wish I'd done it. I wish I'd done it. So I think that experience has changed my perception on people's advice, right? Yeah. Like I think
initially I found it harder to respect what people were saying. But now obviously understand they're not saying what they've done, they're saying what they wish they did.
Yeah, they're giving you future advice for you rather than what they wish they'd done.
Yeah. And so I think that makes all of a sudden it all starts to click into place. And I guess as you go through your career, there are points in time where you make a decision or you heed or don't heed some advice, which then 5-10 years down the line, you're like, I get it. And so I think there's been a lot of that coming in the last.
No, great. I was going to wrap up there because I just think it's been great. We talked through your journey and given some good takeaways, and you can listen to yourself when you're walking your dog next time as well.
I cannot think of anything worse.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode just as much as I did recording it. Now, don't forget to subscribe on your usual platform, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast, so you never miss a future episode. Want to stay ahead in Treasury? Fantastic. Sign up for our newsletter. There's a link in the show notes. You'll get instant access to my pay review action plan for you, Treasury professionals. Free guide to help you prepare for salary negotiations, maximize your salary at your next pay review. You'll also get early access to our 2025 Treasury Salary Trends Whitepaper. And if you take part in our salary survey as well at treasurysalary.com, we can send you our January review of salaries as well. And by signing up to the newsletter, you'll get access to our CV, resume, templates, career tips. What could be better? It's amazing. If you're looking for a role, go to the website, treasuryrecruitment.com, or maybe even join us at any of our 2025 events and conferences. We're right the way across. We're going from the US back through the UK, right the way across Europe, Dublin. It's going to be a great year in 2025. So looking forward to it. Go to our events page, treasuryrecruitment.com/events, and sign up. Meet us in New York in March or anywhere else you want to see us in the rest of the world. Thanks for listening. Until next week, see you soon.